When a liberal TV host tried to corner Elon Musk over Pope Francis's legacy on live television, she didn't expect him to turn the entire room, the internet, and the conversation upside down. When Elon Musk agreed to appear on the global table, no one expected it to be a quiet night. The show was known for its fire, the kind of live interviews that trended before they even finished airing. And Lena Hartley, the host? She was the kind of media figure who didn't just ask questions. She engineered moments. Young, sharp, media savvy, Lena built her reputation by pushing the line and daring her guests to cross it. She wasn't rude, she was refined, but everyone knew she came to win. The topic of tonight's episode had already stirred a storm: the recent death of Pope Francis, a global spiritual icon, a controversialis reformer, revered by many, criticized by others, and now gone. Lena framed the episode as a cultural roundtable, but no one was fooled. This wasn't a conversation, it was a setup. Elon Musk stepped onto the stage just before the opening credits rolled. No entourage, no notes, no script. He wore a muted jacket over a black shirt, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed. He looked like a man who'd rather be building rockets, but knew how to land in the middle of a media storm and walk out dry. The audience, a curated mix of intellectuals, influencers, and cultural critics, sat poised, phones hidden but ready. They weren't here for small talk, they were here for impact. The lights dimmed, the stage glowed, and Lena's voice came through the intro with surgical polish. Tonight we talk about power, legacy, and belief in a world run by data. And joining me is the man behind Tesla, X, Neuralink, and more recently, an empire of controversy, Elon Musk. Welcome. He nodded once. Thanks. And just like that, the conversation began. But behind Lena's smile was a plan. She didn't bring Elon on just to talk tech. She brought him on to make him answer for something bigger, and he knew it. Lena started with a smile, the kind that looked warm but carried weight. So Elon, she said, settling into her chair, before we dive into heavier things, what's next? Mars? AI gods? Brain chips? The crowd chuckled lightly, polite, curious, measured. Elon shrugged, calm. All of the above. Survival first, wonder second. He spoke the way he always did, like someone halfway between a philosopher and an engineer. Disarming, director, almost bored. Lena nodded, pretending to jot something down on the card in her lap. But she wasn't writing. She was watching. What does wonder look like to you? She asked. Elon leaned back, thoughtful. A kid seeing Earth from orbit, a civilization that makes it past the filters. Again, short answers. No showmanship, just substance. Lena was listening, but not lingering. Her questions danced forward, touching on the ethics of AI, the limits of free speech, the fine line between innovation and exploitation. Elon answered them all with ease, sometimes blunt, sometimes layered, always in control. But there was something in Lena's eyes, not tension, not yet, but intent. Like a chess player watching the board shift, waiting for the right moment to strike. She smiled at the right moments, laughed softly when the audience did. But under the surface, the air was changing. This wasn't about Mars, or Tesla, or the next IPO. This was about narrative, culture, power. She was building a runway, and Musk knew it. He gave her just enough rope, just enough data. Never defensive, never distracted. He knew this game. He'd seen this table before. You've been called the most influential man in the world, Lena said at one point. Do you feel the weight of that? Elon tilted his head. Influence is temporary. Impact is what matters. Applause trickled in, but Lena didn't blink. Because the real conversation hadn't started yet, she was still setting the table, and Elon Musk was already sharpening his knife. The shift was so subtle, most people missed it, but Elon didn't. Lena leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, voice lower now, intimate, deliberate. "So, Elon," she began, letting the pause stretch just long enough to feel like pressure. "The world just lost a spiritual leader in Pope Francis." Her tone was reverent, but there was something else underneath. A blade, just barely sheathed. She continued, "But some say he stood in the way of progress. Tradition, doctrine, stances that feel regressive. Wouldn't you agree?" The words dropped like marbles on glass. The audience didn't move, but the energy shifted. This wasn't about tech anymore. This was the turn. Elon tilted his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the angle. His face didn't flinch, not amused, not annoyed, just interested. He let the silence hold a moment longer than expected, calculated, intentional. Then he smiled, faint, almost imperceptible. "Define progress," he said. A single heartbeat. That answer, quiet but sharp, landed harder than anything loud. Lena blinked, recovering fast, but not before a flicker crossed her face, a crack, a ripple. She straightened, smiling politely, but her fingers tightened on the cue cards in her lap. She thought she had him in a corner. But Elon didn't live in corners, and now the temperature in the studio was changing. Lena didn't back off. She leaned in. This was the moment she had prepared for, the switch from soft curiosity to cultural confrontation. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, expression unreadable. "Well," she said, "if we're defining progress, maybe it looks like evolving past exclusion." Her voice didn't waver. She was on script now. "The church under Pope Francis may have sounded more inclusive," she said, eyes locked on Elon, "but let's be honest. The institution still struggled with gender equality, LGBTQ+ recognition, and accountability. He spoke of climate change, yes, but didn't challenge capitalism in any meaningful way." The crowd hummed softly, some nodding, some bracing. Lena delivered it like a verdict, balanced, poised, strategic. "He was a man of compassion," she added, "but also contradiction." That was the word she landed on, contradiction, like a mic drop that didn't need volume. Elon didn't blink. He shifted slightly in his seat, eyes narrowing just a hair. Then he spoke, calm, crisp. "All humans are contradictions." He let the words hang, heavy but effortless. "That's what makes them real." The audience stilled. Even the hums quieted. He wasn't defending doctrine. He wasn't attacking reform. He was cutting through the performance. Lena opened her mouth, a rebuttal cued, but Elon beat her to it. "Pope Francis wasn't a perfect man," he said. "That's what made him worth listening to." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't gasp. They just listened. Because they weren't watching a debate anymore. They were watching a shift in the balance of control. And Lena Hartley felt it, right down to the silence in her own studio. Lena's smile tightened, not because she was losing, not yet, but because Musk wasn't taking the bait the way most did. He wasn't flinching, wasn't hedging, just answering, thoughtfully, calmly. And that made him harder to corner. So she sharpened her tone just a little. "Let me ask you something," she said, voice casual but loaded. "Isn't belief in religion, especially one so rooted in tradition, a barrier to innovation?" There it was, not quite a punch, but a jab. The crowd chuckled. A few knowing laughs, the kind that say we're smarter than all that old stuff. It wasn't just a question, it was a cultural signal, and they picked it up. But Elon didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't take the bait the way she wanted. Instead, he tilted his head like he was examining the shape of the question itself, not dodging it, but dissecting it. Then, in that quiet, nonchalant tone of his, he said, "Only if you think innovation is purely technical." The laughter stopped, not because it was offensive, but because no one saw it coming. Lena's expression barely changed, but she was listening now, more carefully than before. Elon leaned back slightly in his chair, relaxed. "You can't innovate without ideas," he added, "and you don't get ideas without imagination. You don't get imagination without belief. He paused, just long enough to make it land. And belief? That's where all this started. No smirk, no smugness, just a statement. The crowd wasn't laughing anymore. They were thinking. And Lena, for the first time, didn't interrupt. Because Elon Musk had just changed the question. And now the real conversation was beginning. The shift was subtle, not a mic drop moment, but a rearranging of gravity. Elon Musk, the so-called man of machines, the engineer of cold logic and colder metal, was talking about belief. And not the market kind, the cosmic kind. You can't build rockets without belief, he said. His voice was steady. No theatrics, just wait. That's what faith is, belief in the unseen, in something that hasn't happened yet, in something that maybe never has. A murmur rippled through the studio, not skepticism, curiosity. This wasn't where they thought this would go. They were expecting a sparring match about religion and reason, tradition and technology. But Elon wasn't sparring, he was building. People think science kills mystery, he continued. But mystery is what drives science. You don't chase answers unless you believe something's worth answering. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. And that made it louder somehow. You think early civilizations looked at the stars and thought, let's build telescopes? No, they looked and thought, there must be more. That's faith. Lena was still smiling, but her fingers weren't on the cue cards anymore. They were on her knee, gripping just slightly. Elon leaned forward, not aggressively, more like a teacher explaining something simple that everyone else made complicated. Pope Francis didn't slow down progress, he said. He reminded us that some things worth preserving don't fit in a lab. The crowd didn't clap, not yet. They weren't sure if they were supposed to. Because what they just heard didn't sound like a billionaire defending religion. It sounded like a man who'd built things no one thought were possible, and was saying none of it worked without wonder. Lena's next question was on her tongue, but the script was gone. And Elon Musk was now the one directing the scene. Lena shifted in her chair just slightly, enough to suggest movement without retreat. Her tone, still calm, now carried the edge of disbelief. But you, she said, locking eyes with Elon, of all people, you understand data, science, logic. Doesn't religion fly in the face of that? It was the question millions were thinking, or expecting her to ask. And she knew it. She delivered it clean, like a final exam question, a challenge dressed as inquiry. The audience leaned in, not a breath wasted. Elon didn't respond right away. He let it hang, let the silence stretch just long enough to make it clear this wasn't going to be a soundbite. Then he spoke, low, even, measured. Not necessarily, he said. His voice carried no spike, no sarcasm, just clarity. Science explains the how. Religion wrestles with the why. The room stilled. Then a few hands clapped. Then more. Not explosive, not forced, just real. That sentence landed, because no matter where you stood on the issue, you felt it. Lena smiled tightly, nodding, but something behind her eyes flickered. This wasn't the way it was supposed to go. She wasn't losing control, but she wasn't leading either. And Elon, unfazed, grounded, sat as if he wasn't in the middle of a cultural battlefield, but at a lunch table, having a conversation he'd had in his head 1,000 times. A conversation the world was now hearing for the first time. And the crowd? They weren't just watching anymore, they were thinking. Lena regrouped, not visibly, but internally, recalibrating. She wasn't finished, not yet. She leaned forward again, softer now, almost human. But Elon, she said, her voice low, doesn't blind faith lead to division, to control, even death? Look at history. She wasn't wrong, and she knew it. It was a powerful point, too powerful to be ignored. Elon didn't interrupt, didn't deflect. He just paused, his gaze lowered slightly, thoughtful, reflective. And then with a voice so calm it cut sharper than anything loud, he answered, "So does blind ideology, Lena?" The crowd stilled. He wasn't being clever, he wasn't posturing, he was stating fact. Whether it wears a collar, he glanced at her, or a camera. A few gasps, one or two laughs, but not the funny kind, the kind people let out when the truth hits harder than expected. Lena blinked. She didn't flinch, not visibly, but her body stilled, like she had walked right into a wall that wasn't supposed to be there. Elon didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just let it land. Because that wasn't a rebuttal. It was a mirror. He sat back slightly, hands folded, letting the silence breathe. Lena opened her mouth to pivot, to move on, but the moment wouldn't budge because the audience wasn't ready. They were still processing what had just been said. And somewhere in the back of the room, someone whispered, "He's not wrong." For the first time all night, Lena faltered. Not visibly, not dramatically, just a brief stutter in the rhythm, a skipped beat in her practiced delivery. She reached for her next card, but didn't look at it. Her eyes were still on Elon, focused, studying. He saw it. She wasn't unraveling. Lena Hartley didn't do that. But the control she had so carefully curated was slipping. And Elon leaned in, just enough to shift the energy again. "You're not really asking about the Pope," he said. His voice was quieter now, but it carried more weight than anything before it. "You're asking if there's still room for values that aren't algorithmic." That word, algorithmic, landed like a stone in still water. No one moved. Even the hum of background tech in the studio seemed to fade, because he had just named the real question beneath all the others. This wasn't about tradition versus progress. It was about whether meaning could still exist outside the metrics, outside engagement rates, retweets, brand deals. Lena didn't respond right away, because what could she say? She had built her platform on data-driven narratives, viral moments, controlled chaos. And here was Elon, the man who built the algorithms everyone else used, questioning whether that kind of world could still make space for soul. The silence stretched. Not awkward, not forced, just real. And in that stillness, the audience started to understand this wasn't about who was winning, it was about what we'd already lost. Elon didn't wait for applause or a rebuttal, he just kept speaking. But now, his words weren't aimed at Lena, not directly. They were aimed beyond her, through the lens, into the homes, the heads, the hearts of whoever was still watching. "You want to know what the world lost?" he said. "It didn't just lose a priest." He paused, letting that sit. "It lost one of the last people willing to remind us we're not gods." That line, simple, unscripted, cracked something open. The audience didn't clap, not right away. They just sat there, still, like the breath had been pulled out of the room. Because they knew exactly what he meant. Elon didn't speak about Pope Francis like a religious figure. He spoke about him like a man who carried paradox, compassion and rigidity, progress and doctrine, not perfectly, but honestly. "A lot of people disagreed with him," Elon continued. "That's fine. I disagreed with him on plenty. But the one thing he never pretended to be was bigger than the people he served." The crowd was silent. Lena didn't interrupt. Elon looked up briefly, scanning the room. Not for validation, but for understanding. He talked about humility, he said. In an age of ego, that's rare, and that's dangerous. Now the silence started to shift. Not tense, not skeptical, just reverent. Because this wasn't the billionaire on stage anymore. This was a man who'd been inside the machine and was now asking if we remembered what it was like to be human. The studio didn't erupt, it didn't need to. It cracked. Quiet nods, tilted heads. A few murmurs passed between rows. Not the usual buzz of live TV, but the kind of hush that follows something true. Even in the front row, the die-hard Lena Hartley loyalists, there were a few subtle shifts. crossed arms that uncrossed, expressions that softened just slightly. Not because they had changed sides, but because something had landed. What Elon said wasn't an opinion, it was a reminder, and reminders have a way of pulling people out of their scripts. Lena held her posture, professional, poised. But she could feel it. The temperature was changing, and not in her favor. She glanced briefly off camera. Her producer stood stiff, hands at her headset, whispering into someone's ear. The control room was moving. Meanwhile, the audience wasn't waiting for the official cut. Phones were already out, subtle, low by the waist, just enough to catch that moment. The line about not being gods, the one about values outside algorithms. Clips hit Twitter before the segment even ended. Elon Musk goes off script and wins. This isn't about religion, it's about what we've forgotten. The global table starts trending. Inside the studio, the applause was still withheld, not out of defiance, out of reflection. Lena had curated this room, but Elon had reshaped it, and he did it without raising his voice. Now the question wasn't if people agreed with him, it was whether they were willing to admit they'd been thinking it all along. Lena wasn't out. She was too good for that. She pivoted like a pro, eyes narrowing just enough to signal strategy. Pope Francis, she began, wasn't just a man of faith. He was a man of action. He challenged the world's richest nations on climate. He called out indifference. He warned against environmental collapse long before it was trending. She paused, letting her voice rise ever so slightly. He said the earth is our common home, that we're caretakers, not owners. The audience responded, a few scattered claps, eager to feel anchored again. Lena saw it. She moved in. Surely you, of all people, Elon, she said, can agree with that part of his legacy? It was a smart move, strategic, something safe, a place where moral high ground and progressive talking points overlapped cleanly. Elon nodded, slowly, deliberately. I do, he said, absolutely. And just as quickly as Lena's confidence began to return, he dismantled it. But it's interesting, he added, voice even, how quickly you quote him when it fits your narrative. The crowd hushed again. You cherry-pick his values like a menu, Elon said, calm but cutting. Environmental justice? Sure. But personal discipline, moral restraint, silence? He tilted his head slightly. You ignore the rest. Lena didn't move, but something flickered in her jaw. A micro-expression of pushback she didn't voice, because she knew what he meant. And worse, the audience did too. Elon leaned back in his chair, not triumphant, just centered. He wasn't using the Pope to win a debate, he was holding up the contradiction for what it was. And the people watching? They weren't just seeing a TV interview anymore, they were seeing what happens when someone speaks without needing to be liked. Lena tried to recover, tried to summon one more pivot, one last volley, but the rhythm was gone. Elon wasn't debating anymore. He was delivering the closing argument to a courtroom that didn't realize it had gone quiet. You want a future powered by reason, he said. No malice, no edge, just clarity. But reason without reverence, he continued, leads to collapse. He didn't follow it up. He didn't expand. He didn't need to. Because that line stopped time. No flash, no theatrics, no performative gesture, just stillness. And in that stillness, the weight of what he said settled like dust over the entire studio. People weren't shifting anymore. They weren't whispering. They were holding. That kind of line doesn't need applause. It demands reflection. Elon didn't move, didn't smile, didn't break the moment. He just let it be. Because he understood what Lena didn't. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave a question hanging in the air. A question too big to answer in a segment. A question that follows people home. Lena forced a smile, the kind you give when you've lost a hand, but still have to shuffle the cards. She turned toward the camera. Well, she said, voice clipped but steady, that was enlightening. It was her way of wrapping it without acknowledging what had happened. Elon just nodded. "Thanks," he said, calm, courteous, unbothered. He stood with that signature nonchalance, like none of this had touched him, like he just walked through fire and didn't feel the heat. He gave a small wave to the audience, no flourish, just presence. And then he walked off stage. Lena watched him go for half a second too long. Then she turned back to the cameras, professionally poised, as producers began cueing the outro. But it was already too late. The audience? They didn't know what to do. Some clapped, a few polite scattered bursts. But others stood quietly, no cheers, just standing, as if they weren't applauding a person, but acknowledging a moment, a truth that wasn't loud, but undeniable. And backstage, the clip had already been sent to the edit bay, but the raw footage, the live stream, was already out, and the internet was already watching. The segment ended, the credits rolled, but the moment didn't go away, because moments like that don't end when the cameras cut. They begin. Within minutes, social media lit up like a fuse line. Elon Musk shuts down anti-faith narrative live. Mic drop moment leaves host stunned. This is why Elon makes people nervous, he thinks. The global table. Musk versus media. Reason and reverence. Clips circulated with lightning speed, stitched into reels, reaction videos, slow-motion breakdowns, every frame analyzed, every pause dissected. That single line, "Reason without reverence leads to collapse," was already printed on t-shirts. Memed, quoted, misquoted, podcasts launched emergency episodes, panel shows reshuffled lineups to unpack the moment. Half the internet praised it as a wake-up call. The other half accused it of being intellectual grandstanding. And Elon? He didn't say a word. No tweet, no follow-up, no clapback. He didn't repost the clip, didn't like it, didn't comment, because he didn't need to. He'd said what he meant, and he'd moved on, somewhere else, in a design lab or maybe at a launch pad. He was already thinking about the next thing, because that's the thing about people like Elon. They don't show up to perform, they show up to shift. And when they do, it's not about noise, it's about direction. Meanwhile, Lena's show issued a polite tweet the next morning. Last night's conversation with Elon Musk sparked important dialogue. Let's keep asking questions. But the internet didn't care. The internet had already picked a side, already clipped the best moments, already moved on to the next battle. But the real impact? It wasn't in the algorithms, it was in the questions people started asking themselves when the screens went dark. What do I believe? Where do my values come from? Have we replaced reverence with performance? And in a world chasing the next click? One man reminded them that stillness can be louder than the storm. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.